Welcome to our Field Botany Community Ecology lecture. We've defined community as all of the species within a defined area that interact with each other. Specifically with this lecture, we're going to be focused on a subset of the whole community, the plant communities. And within the plant community, we're going to be emphasizing some of the basic community ecology concepts that were introduced in your reading by providing local examples. And the secondary purpose is that by doing so, we'll be able to introduce you to some of our local plants and also some of our local plant communities. You read a little bit about competition. So one kind of competition that is commonly occurring between plants is resource competition. This is a negative interaction, which means both of the organisms engaged in the interspecific interaction are negatively impacted. Specifically, resource competition is an interaction in which organisms are using the same limiting resource. So with plants, limiting resources often include things like space or sunlight or water or nutrients. Resource competition can be intraspecific, which means it's occurring between members of the same species, or it can be interspecific, which means it's occurring between members of different species. One local example of both kinds of resource competition is a young knobcone pine stand. Knobcone pine is a common tree in Siskiyou County. It colonizes recently burned sites. So this is a light-loving plant, and when a fire comes through and clears out the understory, its seeds are released, they germinate, and they thrive. As those plants get larger, there's intense intraspecific competition. So they start to compete with each other for resources. Another concept that you read about is competitive exclusion. And this idea is that when two species compete for the same limiting resource, they won't be able to coexist. So one of those organisms is going to be eliminated from the site. It's the inferior competitor that will be excluded from that site. And the organism that's more efficient at using the resources that are available is the one that we would expect to continue to see growing in that particular place. So back to our knobcone pine stand, if we think about now we've got these older individuals, knobcone pines, growing on this site. They're taller plants, they're casting shade onto the forest floor. Their offspring can't exist in those conditions. Remember I said they're light-loving plants. So their offspring are going to be disadvantaged in that situation where there's not a lot of sunlight on the forest floor. So we would start to see other species that are more tolerant of shade taking over, and we would expect to see knobcone pine eliminated from that particular site through competitive exclusion over time. So your Boundless book talked about predation, which is defined as a positive-negative interaction in which one animal consumes another. So that doesn't necessarily relate to plants, except if you consider insectivory a form of predation. So insectivory is a positive-negative interaction in which a plant consumes an animal. Now, obviously, this isn't very common. We learned about photosynthesis. That's the way plants are getting the energy that they need. They don't need to consume other organisms in order to get energy. They make it themselves. However, some plants have evolved the ability to trap and digest insects in order to supplement their nutrient intake. A local example of a carnivorous or an insectivorous plant is Darlingtonia californica. The picture here shows two Darlingtonia leaves. These are pitcher-shaped leaves. That's where it gets its common name, the California pitcher plant. And those pitchers contain water and some digestive enzymes and a community of microorganisms and insects. Insects become trapped inside the pitcher. There's downward facing hairs. There's also these little windows that allow light in and disorient the insects, so they think they're climbing out when they see the light, but they continue to fall back down into the water. The plant secretes a digestive enzyme that starts to digest the insects, and then it can take in the nutrients. Darlingtonia californica needs to supplement its diet because it grows in very nutrient poor ultramafic soils, and we've read a little bit about those soils already. So this isn't exactly predation, but it's the closest thing we have to predator-prey interactions in the plant kingdom. You read a little bit about herbivory. Herbivory is an interaction in which an organism eats part of a plant or part of an algae. This is an important interspecific interaction. It can have a large influence on the distribution and the abundance of plants. One local example of an herbivore that's having a huge impact on trees in California currently is bark beetles. There's actually a few species of bark beetles right now that are causing a lot of tree mortality. These beetles bore into the bark of plants. They lay eggs, their larvae feed on the sugary fluids in the phloem. As they get into the plant, they introduce pathogens into the phloem. Once they're in the vascular system, they can spread all around the plant. So this is a huge problem currently. In 2014, bark beetles cause losses of over 800,000 acres of coniferous trees in the state of California. You also read a little bit about symbiotic relationships. These are relationships that occur when you have two or more species living in direct contact with one another. One example is wolf lichen. So this is the chartreuse green lichen that you see growing on many trees in the region. It's pictured here on a ponderosa pine tree. All lichens represent a symbiotic relationship between one fungus and an algae or a cyanobacteria. Symbiotic relationships can be parasitic. So you read a little bit about parasitism. This is an interaction in which a parasite is deriving nourishment from a host. The parasite's often much smaller than the host. The parasite benefits from this interaction where the host is usually negatively impacted. They aren't typically killed, so the host generally survives, but it's negatively impacted in terms of its survival or its reproduction by the presence of the parasite. We have many local examples of parasitic interactions. I have a gall pictured here. That's an example of a parasitic infection. So the insect, in this case it's a wasp, bores into a plant stem and then causes the plant to create this little structure for it, this home. It lives inside that gall where it feeds off of the plant. It's an example of a positive-negative interaction. Some symbiotic interactions are mutualistic, so those are interactions that benefit both organisms. Mutualisms can have a huge effect on the distribution of populations and also on the succession of communities. So here I have a picture of deer brush, which is in the genus Ceanothus. These organisms have nitrogen-fixing bacteria living in their roots, so this is mutualistic. The plant is benefited because it has a source of nitrogen. The bacteria is benefited because it has a home in the plant roots. The other mutualism that I have pictured here is pollination. So pollination benefits plants because it helps them reproduce sexually. It benefits the pollinators, which in this case you might not be able to see it, but there's a hummingbird there. It's benefited because it's drinking nectar from the plant. So it's getting a food source, the plant is getting reproduction. Those interspecific interactions that we just looked at involved two species. However, there are other community attributes and features that encompass more of the community, and that includes concepts like disturbance, species diversity, and dominant and keystone species. Disturbance is a really important non-living or abiotic factor that shapes communities. It's defined as any relatively discrete event that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure and changes resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So examples of ecological disturbances include events such as fires and floods and storms, and volcanic eruptions, mudslides, glaciation, and then human activities such as development. Fire is an example of an ecological disturbance that is hugely important in Northern California forests. Fire is a common part of our forested ecosystems. Historic fire return intervals are estimated to be somewhere between 11 and 16 years in our montane forests. So those communities have evolved with regular disturbances by fire, regular and frequent disturbances by fire. It's 11 to 16 years is an average, but of course the fire return interval and the intensity of fire is going to be heterogeneous within a community and within a landscape based on the climate, the topography, the community of plants that's already there. Some of them are highly flammable, some of them are going to be less flammable. Human activity is also going to have a huge impact on fire regimes. Obviously, we've been suppressing fire for decades now, so we've made that fire return interval a lot longer. And the intensity of fires has also been impacted greatly by human activity. By suppressing fires, we've allowed more fuels to build up on the ground, causing the fires that do start to burn much hotter and to burn more land. Some of our plants in our local flora are highly adapted to live with fire. These include the knobcone pine, which we already talked about. I told you that it sprouts after a fire. That's because it has what are called serotinous cones. The bottom picture here is an image of those serotinous cones. Those seed scales are stuck shut with resin, and it requires heat from a fire to open those seed scales up and allow the seeds to drop to the forest floor. We also see some trees like the one pictured in the top image with extremely thick bark. That bark protects those living tissues in the inner bark, like the phloem cells, so it allows those trees to experience fire but survive. We also see some adaptations to fire in hardwood trees. We have many examples of oaks that resprout from the stems or from the roots after fire, so that they can reemerge after their trunks have been damaged by a fire. So we have a lot of examples of adaptations to fire in the California flora, certainly in our local flora. We also see impacts of fire on our local communities and landscapes in general. So fires help to maintain an open understory by eliminating small trees. You hear quotes of some of the early settlers to Northern California talking about being able to, quickly ride a horse or even pull a carriage through a lot of our montane forests. They had a relatively open understory as a result of the quick fire return intervals. Fire also generates a pulse of nutrients to the soils that some plants need in order to regenerate. It also creates patches where the bare mineral soil is exposed. Some plants require those conditions. They can't germinate in litter. They require that bare soil in order to regenerate. As small trees are killed by fire, that's going to reduce the competition for water and for nutrients in the soil. And fire is really important in creating heterogeneity on a small scale. So fire doesn't burn evenly. There'll be some places that the fire skips where you may have some small trees remaining. You may have some patches of bare ground. That really helps to promote the diversity on a stand scale and also on a landscape scale. As I mentioned before, fire suppression has had a pretty big impact on our fire return interval. So it's increased, and that's had a lot of ecological impacts. We're starting to see the flora change as a result of the reduced as a result of the lengthened fire return interval. It's also led to higher fuels on the ground and more severe fires when they do burn. Species diversity is another large-scale community concept. It's defined as the species richness, which is the number of species present in a community, but it also takes into account the relative abundances of those species. So if you take a look at the images on the bottom of the screen, you see two communities. They both have the same number of species. However, the distribution of species, the relative abundances of species in community B is more even. So there's about equal relative abundances of all of those trees in that community. Whereas in community A, we see dominance by this one tree species. As a result, they have the same species richness. However, community B would end up having a higher ranking for species diversity because that measure takes into account not only richness, but also the relative abundance of the individuals within the community. Ecologists have documented a pretty impressive array of benefits to a community if it has a high level of biodiversity. This includes things like increased productivity, increased resistance to pests like insect pests or invasive species, increased resilience after a disturbance, meaning that a diverse community more quickly seems to recover species after a disturbance than a community with low diversity. We also tend to see a greater variety of habitat for animals in plant communities that are highly diverse. And we live in an area of extreme plant diversity. So it's a notable, the North Coast and the Klamath Mountains are known for their high plant diversity. You read a little bit about this in the article that you read by John Sawyer. He described things like the long ecological history, the fact that a lot of this area in Northern California escaped recent glaciation, a huge amount of habitat diversity because of the diversity in climate and topography, also the regular disturbance by things such as fire, and the geographic location of Northwest California along the Pacific coast, which means we have species that are at the southern portion of their range in this region, so species that are distributed further north. Then we also have some species that are at the northern extent of their range in Northern California. So there's a lot more information about this in that reading. So make sure you take a good look at that and understand his reasoning or his explanation for the extremely high plant diversity in Northern California. Another larger scale community concept is the concept of a dominant species. A dominant species is one that is highly abundant in the community, maybe the one that has the highest biomass within the community. These species tend to be competitively superior. That's the reason why they're so abundant. Some of them are successful at avoiding predation or herbivory in the case of plants. Most of them have a huge impact on the community. So one local example of a increasingly dominant species is the white fir, Abies concolor. This plant is highly shade tolerant, which means it's capable of growing up in the shade of other plants. So it's capable of photosynthesizing in understory, low light conditions, and is better at doing that than other plants. Where many people are attributing the increasing dominance of white fir in our local montane forests to fire suppression. So without the fires coming in and opening up the canopy, allowing some of the shade intolerant species the space and the conditions that they need to survive, we're seeing increasing dominance of this shade tolerant species, white fir, and also other shade tolerant species like incense cedar. Your book talked about a foundational species, which is one that's shaping the physical conditions within the habitat. And the example they mentioned was coral. So coral animals build the coral reefs, they create the substrate upon which other organisms are living. And it's possible that you might consider white fir to be a foundational species in our montane forests, because not only is it becoming more and more dominant, but it's creating those really shady conditions that foster the shade tolerant community that we're starting to see. We also have local examples of keystone species. So you read about a keystone species like a dominant species. A keystone species has a large impact on a community, but unlike a dominant species, they're not very abundant. So one local example of a keystone species is the salmon. So salmon are, part of our aquatic communities for a brief period of time when they've migrated upstream in order to spawn. When they're here, they're a really important food source for a lot of our wildlife species. We're learning more and more about the importance of the nutrients in their bodies. So when they die after they spawn, their nutrients appear to be a really important part of the nutrient budget in the riparian plant communities, the communities that are adjacent to the streams. So they are an example of keystone species. They're not even here a lot of the time. They're not very numerous, but they appear to be having a pretty big impact on our local animal and plant populations. So moving on to the idea of community dynamics, how communities change over time. You learned about the concept of ecological succession, or the change in a community over time. We have many local examples of both primary and secondary succession. Primary succession being the kind of succession that occurs on bare minerals. So this is the kind of succession that occurs after a volcanic eruption. So we have lots of examples of primary succession occurring on the substrates that were created by the eruption of Mount Shasta. Secondary succession is succession occurring in a site after a disturbance, like a fire. Lots of examples of secondary succession occurring in burned areas locally. With secondary succession things tend to happen a lot more quickly because you still have soils intact. So secondary succession tends to proceed more quickly than primary succession. John Sawyer talks about the stand dynamics model of succession being a pretty good fit for the kind of succession, ecological succession, that we see occurring in the forests of the Klamath Mountains. In this model of succession, we have an establishment phase, which down here in this diagram is called the stand initiation phase. So this is where you have sun-loving seedlings colonizing a site. These individuals are going to be able to grow really fast because there's not a lot of competition at that point. The next phase, which Sawyer refers to as the young forest, in this diagram it's called the stem exclusion phase. This is where all of those small plants are growing up and they're beginning to compete with each other for resources in the soil and also for sunlight. So this is where we start to see thinning occurring, and you can see here in this diagram some of these trees are starting to die back. In the mature forest, which on this diagram is called the understory reinitiation phase, we have fewer larger trees. So that's a result of the competition that led to thinning in the young forest. So now we've got fewer large trees, and that's going to leave some gaps in the canopy so that understory plants can begin to colonize the site. Finally, in the absence of any large-scale disturbance that was going to set this community back, we might attain what's called the old growth phase. This is where we have fewer yet large trees, big canopy gaps that are supporting a mature understory. You can see here that we've got multiple layers within the understory and trees of varied ages present. So John Sawyer gives an example of this that we commonly see in the eastern Klamaths, where you would have a fire coming through and burning a Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, montane forests. After that fire, when there's a lot of light reaching the forest floor, we see a lot of shrubs coming in. These are shrubs such as deer brush, which is an example of a plant that fixes nitrogen. We talked a little bit about that already. So that's an example of a pioneer species. Your book talked about pioneer species. These first ones that make it to a disturbed site, and they are often involved with modifying the site in order to make it more conducive to the growth of other plants. So now that we've got, nutrient-rich soils on this site, these shrubs are going to get shaded out by trees, and then eventually we'll get into the mature or even old growth forests. Last, I wanted to highlight some of our local plant communities, some of which we'll be able to see and study on our ecosystems field trip this weekend. So the montane hardwood conifer forest is one that we find approximately at elevations lower than 3,500 feet locally. This community includes conifers such as Douglas fir, the ghost pine, knobcone pine, and ponderosa pine. It's called a hardwood conifer forest because it also includes many broadleaf trees. A lot of these are oaks, such as the California black oak, tan oak, canyon live oak, and we also see a lot of shrubs in the hardwood conifer forest, so sort of areas of chaparral, which would include species such as deer brush and manzanita. This is the type of community that you're going to see a lot of if you're driving down I-5 south to Reading. So a lot of what you're seeing out your car window is going to be montane hardwood conifer forest. Moving up in elevation, we see what's called a mixed conifer forest. So it's going to be dominated by conifers, and this is going to be in a band of elevation above about 3,500 feet and then below about 6,500 or 6,900 feet. The mixed conifer forest, as I mentioned, is increasingly dominated by shade-tolerant species such as white pine and incense cedar with fire suppression. At the lower elevations within that spread, 3,500 to about 6,900 feet, we'll find other species, including Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and also sugar pine. Towards the higher end of that belt, we'll see other conifers, including the Shasta red fir or the noble fir, intermixing with white fir and other components of the mixed conifer forest. Moving up in elevation, we have what's called a subalpine forest. The subalpine forest is going to be the highest elevation belt that's dominated by trees. Above tree line, we have what's called an alpine area where we still have plant life, but trees are going to be really, really sparse, and it's going to be dominated by herbaceous plants. So unlike in the mixed conifer forests and in the hardwood conifer forests, abiotic conditions are really important in shaping the subalpine forest community. And that's because the abiotic conditions in this community are really extreme. So it's cold, the growing season is really short, the winds are extreme, the exposure to, the ionizing radiation from the sun is going to be higher. We also have shallow soils, so those harsh growing conditions are also really limiting for bacterial growth, so there's not a lot of decomposition of organic matter feeding the soils. Some people would refer to this as a woodland rather than a forest because these conditions make it so that the trees aren't thriving, and there's a lot of space in between the trees. It's a much more open canopy, which means that, rather than the dynamics being driven by competition like we see in the lower elevation forests, this community is really highly affected by those abiotic conditions. It's going to include trees such as the mountain hemlock, the noble fir, the Shasta red fir. We talked about those also being components of the higher elevation bands within the mixed conifer forest, and then a whole slew of high elevation pines, which includes plants like the white bark pine, the foxtail pine, and the western white pine. Moving down in elevation a little bit, we have what's referred to as an east side pine forest. So these forests are generally found in drier areas, so areas that are in the rain shadow, like the eastern side of Mount Shasta or the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So the growing conditions aren't as great. The trees are going to be more limited by water availability. We tend to see a more open forest canopy, and we tend to see more of the plants that are also associated with the upper Sonoran or high desert community, including plants like western juniper, and then in the understory, things like Great Basin sagebrush and antelope brush. So unfortunately, exceptions are sort of the rule here. So these communities aren't these, nice little discrete units. They bleed into each other, and there's also other factors at play that are going to, cause the community to change on smaller scales. That could include something like a river. So, with greater access to water all year round, we tend to see more deciduous species near a river. We're going to see a different suite of species on recently burned sites. We may see more knobcone pine or more shrubs in those early successional sites. And then we're also going to see huge variation in some of the patterns that I just described in local sites where the substrates are ultramafic. Ultramafic soils tend to support a much more open canopy, so maybe more of a woodland rather than a forest. Sometimes we see, lack of trees and shrubs dominating those sites. Keep in mind some really useful indicators of serpentine soils. These include plants like the Jeffrey pine, the Port Orford cedar on wet sites, and then also the foxtail pine in subalpine sites. So my point here was just to kind of introduce you to these broad scale patterns and to talk about some of the exceptions. My hope is that we'll become much more familiar with these communities and these patterns as we explore these communities in the field. And in general, if you're curious about local community dynamics and local communities, these are excellent sources to refer to.